They once seemed like the kind of stars who would live forever in America's memory. On screen, Good Times brought laughter, warmth, and one of the most unforgettable families in television history. But in real life, some of the show's most beloved faces met endings far darker than viewers ever imagined. John Amos, the strong father figure millions trusted, entered his final years under the shadow of family turmoil. Esther Roll, the woman who held the Evans family together, endured a painful physical decline before her death. So what happened that led the stars behind a television world that once felt so comforting to such tragic, chilling, and haunting ends? Let's look back at the Good Times actors whose deaths were the most horrifying of all. Number 1. John Amos, a father icon haunted by final turmoil. In Good Times, John Amos almost became the very definition of a father on television. As James Evans Sr., he came across as the kind of man who could bring weight, order, and an unshakable sense of dignity to an entire household, just by standing in the frame. For millions of viewers, he was a symbol of strength, self-respect, and a portrayal of a black father that American television at the time rarely gave audiences with that level of seriousness and respect. And maybe that is exactly why the way he left this world felt so shocking. No one expected the man who once stood for toughness, discipline, and dignity to enter his final chapter surrounded by family fractures, suspicion, and a cloud of instability hanging over his name. His death did not arrive like a clear farewell. It felt more like a door opening far too late, revealing a reality that was sadder, messier, and far colder than the image audiences had held on to for decades. He died on August 21, 2024, in Los Angeles at the age of 84. It was not until October 1st that the news was publicly announced. Later, his death certificate showed that the cause was congestive heart failure, that no autopsy was performed, and that his remains were cremated just 9 days after his passing. It was that delay that made the story feel so chilling. A television icon, a father figure who had made millions of viewers feel grounded and secure, left this world in a haze of delay, uncertainty, and unease so deep that the public almost did not know whether to grieve first or start asking questions first. And when that news finally came out, it landed right in the middle of a family situation that had already been fractured for some time. His daughter, Shannon Amos, had publicly said she feared her father was being abused and financially exploited. John Amos, on the other hand, repeatedly denied those claims and said that his son, Casey Amos, was caring for him properly. The Los Angeles Police Department later investigated the matter, but eventually closed the case after finding insufficient evidence to support any wrongdoing. What made the story so heavy was not a final conclusion, but the lingering uncertainty around it. On one side were the daughter's accusations. On the other was John Amos's own denial. Then came an investigation that led to no charges. On paper, the matter was closed, but in the public mind, the unease never really went away. Instead of a peaceful final chapter, viewers were left watching a legend pass away amid suspicion, family division, and a truth that never seemed fully settled. And that is where John Amos's story stopped feeling like an ordinary farewell and started touching something far more uncomfortable about show business and about the way society looks at aging, fame, and family. We love honoring men like him when they still appear strong, principled, and capable of holding an entire home together. But when those same icons grow old, become more fragile, and get pulled into family conflict or legal controversy, public admiration can shift into scrutiny almost overnight. A whole life suddenly gets compressed into a few headline phrases. Abused? Exploited? Did his daughter learn of his death through the media? Details that stir curiosity more than genuine understanding. That is why John Amos's death felt shocking, not because it was dramatic on the surface, but because of the deep unease it left behind. The man who made millions believe in the image of a father who could not be broken ultimately passed away in a final chapter, overshadowed by family conflict, delayed information, and truths being pulled in different directions. A figure who once stood for steadiness and safety ended his life in an atmosphere so unsettled that even the beautiful memory people had of him now feels touched by sadness and instability. Number 2. Esther Rolla, the soul of Good Times, faded in pain. In Good Times, Esther Rolla did not just play Florida Evans, she was almost the backbone that gave the entire show its soul. Florida was the kind of mother who could make an entire house fall still the moment she spoke, the kind of woman who made viewers believe that no matter how hard life pushed that family to the edge, she would be the one still standing at the very end, holding everything together. That sense of seriousness, faith, and nearly unshakable dignity turned Esther Rolla into something far bigger than a sitcom star. She was remembered not just as an actress, but as one of the rare images of a black woman on American television at that time, who was written with real depth, seriousness, and respect. And off-screen, Esther defended that image just as fiercely as Florida defended her family. She pushed back against the increasingly exaggerated direction of Good Times, because she understood exactly what was at stake. Once the character was turned into a joke, the dignity of the family she represented could start slipping with it. Maybe that is also why the final chapter of her life feels more painful than people expect. Esther Rolla had seemed so strong for so long that it is hard to picture her slowly losing that battle with her own body. In her final years, she struggled with complications from diabetes. Her health declined badly, and she had to undergo kidney dialysis before her death in 1998 at the age of 78. A woman who had once been the emotional anchor of an entire family on screen was ultimately forced to endure the very real collapse of her own body off-screen. Some people may see that as nothing more than the familiar tragedy of old age and chronic illness. But the truth feels harsher than the way the public tends to gloss over it. People needed Esther Rolla to stay strong. They needed her standing tall as a symbol. But as her body weakened and her life entered its darkest stretch, the world did not really stay with that pain for very long. Maybe that is why Esther Rolla's death feels sadder than simple loss. It is a reminder that even the women who once seemed strongest, the ones who held everything together for everyone else, can still end up quietly collapsing in pain after the lights have gone down and the applause is long gone. Number 3. Jeanette Dubois, a radiant star. Gone in sudden silence. How does a woman who once seemed to light up the screen the moment she appeared end up leaving this world in a silence that feels almost chilling? In Good Times, Jeanette Dubois was not just Willona Woods. She was almost the burst of life that gave the show air, sharpness, and a very particular kind of elegance. Willona was the kind of woman who could shift the rhythm of a scene just by showing up. She did not need to raise her voice to be noticed, and she did not need to turn everything into drama to become unforgettable. It was that vibrant presence, that confidence, and that natural glow that made Jeanette one of the most memorable faces in Good Times, the kind of woman audiences almost assumed would always stay that radiant. Maybe that is exactly why her death feels more haunting than people expect. Jeanette Dubois died on February 17, 2020, at her home in Glendale at the age of 74. Authorities said she appeared to have died of natural causes, with no signs of foul play. But sometimes explanations that are brief only make people ask why it happened so suddenly, because they do not offer an answer that feels emotionally complete. No scandal, no chaos. Just a morning when the world suddenly realized that one of Good Times' brightest sources of energy had gone permanently silent. Some people would call that a peaceful passing, but sometimes the most unsettling death is not the most violent one. Sometimes it is the fact that someone who once seemed so full of light can go out so quickly, so quietly, and leave behind a void so cold that no one really knows what could ever fill it. Number 4. Johnny Brown, the smile that ended in silence. Who would have imagined that a man who seemed to bring laughter almost by instinct would end up leaving this world in such a sudden collapse? In Good Times, Johnny Brown was not the center of the Evans family, but Nathan Bookman was the kind of character who could change the rhythm of the whole show the moment he appeared. He had a very particular kind of charm, energetic, sly, and just charismatic enough to keep a character who could have turned into a cartoon, feeling vivid and unforgettable instead. Viewers remembered Johnny Brown because he made them laugh, but behind that laughter was a real stage performer, a man who had moved through Broadway, television, and music with a level of energy that seemed almost impossible to run out of. Maybe that is exactly why his death felt so especially jarring. In 2022, at the age of 84, he died after going into cardiac arrest and collapsing just after a routine pacemaker check. What makes the story so haunting is how ordinary the moment was, how everyday it felt, as if there had been no warning large enough for either his family or the audience to brace themselves. And that is what makes Johnny Brown's death sad in such a difficult-to-name way. On one level, it is the familiar cruelty of old age, when the body can suddenly betray a person in what should have been an ordinary moment. But on another level, it hurts because Johnny Brown had brought so much laughter for so long that people grew used to remembering him as part of joy itself, and forgot that beyond the spotlight, he too was moving quietly toward the same final limit as everyone else. Johnny Brown was the kind of man audiences remembered for his smile, but the way his life ended forces people to face a sad truth. Sometimes the thing that disappears fastest is the very sense of aliveness a person seemed to carry with them their entire life. Number 5. Ben Powers, A Promising Life. Cut short too soon. Not everyone who appeared in Good Times left behind the feeling of a promise cut short, but Ben Powers did. As Keith Anderson, Thelma's husband, he entered the series with the look of a brighter future, as if after everything the Evans family had struggled through, there was finally an opening marked by youth, love, and hope. Ben Powers did not have the overpowering presence of John Amos or the symbolic weight of Esther Rolle, but there was something about him that makes people look back with real regret. The confidence, the calmness, and the sense that the road ahead should have opened much wider for him. After Good Times, he continued appearing in Laugh-In, Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer, and a handful of film projects, but his career never truly exploded the way many people once imagined it might. Maybe that is exactly why his death feels more heartbreaking than expected. Ben Powers died in 2015 at just 64, an age that still feels young enough to make people think it should not have ended that soon. When news of his death first broke, the cause was not widely disclosed, which gave his passing a quiet, closed-off, unfinished feeling. Later, some sources reported that he died of liver cancer, and that detail only makes the story sadder. Liver cancer is not the kind of ending the public remembers because it is loud or dramatic, but it is one of the cruelest deaths in the way it works quietly, wearing a person down from the inside and pulling them out of life far earlier than anyone imagined. What lingers in Ben Powers' story is not just that he died at 64, but that someone who carried that sense of youth, steadiness, and promise was stopped by a final chapter so heavy. And maybe that is the saddest part of all. A man who once seemed to represent the future ended up leaving too soon, before life ever answered how far he really could have gone. Number 6. Raymond Allen, A Familiar Face, Lost to Fragile Years. In Good Times, Raymond Allen was not the kind of face who walked in and stole every bit of attention, but Ned the Wino was one of those characters who made the world of the show feel more real, rougher around the edges, and just a little sadder. There was something worn, weathered, and unsteady about him that felt impossible to fake, as if the moment he appeared, viewers were suddenly looking at a piece of life that had been forgotten out on the margins of society. Maybe that is also why the final chapter of Raymond Allen's life feels heavier than people expect. In 2020, he died at the age of 91 after a long struggle with respiratory problems, including several bouts of pneumonia in the years before. His family said it was a respiratory illness unrelated to COVID-19, But it was that long, slow physical decline that made his death feel sad in such a cold way. And that is what makes the story hit even harder. A man who once brought the image of people living at the edge of life onto the screen ended up leaving this world in that same kind of fragility, exhaustion, and quiet wear that time had slowly carved into his body. Number 7. Helen Martin, forgotten presence with a heavy ending. There are some actors who do not need much screen time to leave you feeling as if they had belonged to that world forever, and Helen Martin was exactly that kind of presence. She was never the star placed at the center of the spotlight, but there was something about her that felt impossible to replace. The moment she stepped into a scene, everything felt less artificial, less weightless, and much closer to real life with all of its hardships still attached. Helen Martin carried the kind of presence of a woman who had lived through too many hard blows for anyone to mistake her for just another performer. Viewers did not simply see her as an actress. They saw her as part of that world itself. Maybe that is also why her death left behind a heavier feeling than people might expect. She died on March 25, 2000, at her home in Monterey, California, of a heart attack at the age of 90. What makes her passing so sad is not the shock of it, but the fact that a woman who had lived through nearly an entire century, who had endured so steadily across stage, film, and television, still could not outrun time in the end. A face that had helped make television's memory feel deeper, ultimately left this world in a silence that felt almost true to the way she had lived, steady, rarely celebrated loudly, yet impossible to replace. Number 8. Louis Gossett Jr., Oscar giant, scarred by life's battles. There are some people whose lives seem to show more scars the more successful they become, and Louis Gossett Jr. was one of them. In the minds of audiences, he was a true giant, the kind of man who could walk into a frame with a presence so undeniable that he made every role feel bigger than itself. He was the first black man to win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, the face audiences never forgot from Roots and an Officer and a Gentleman, and the kind of performer who carried the weight of an entire era just by showing up. But behind that greatness, Louis Gossett Jr.'s life was never truly an easy one. He spoke openly about the damage racism had done to him, about the period after Oscar glory when he fell into alcohol and cocaine, and about the later battles he had to fight with illness, from prostate cancer to COVID-19. Maybe that is exactly why the death of Louis Gossett Jr. felt heavier than an ordinary loss. He died in March 2024 at the age of 87, but his family did not publicly disclose a specific cause. And it was that quietness that gave his final chapter such a particular kind of sadness. A man who had lived through racism, addiction, illness, and the wounds left by Hollywood itself ultimately left this world in a silence so brief it felt almost chilling. Number 9. Thalmus Rasulala, a quiet talent, claimed by sudden darkness. Thalmus Rasulala was the kind of actor who did not need much noise around him to leave a strong impression on screen. There was a calmness, intelligence, and a very particular kind of gravity in his presence that gave even smaller roles more depth than people expected. He was never the kind of star surrounded by constant media attention, but he had the kind of face that could make an entire scene feel heavier the moment he appeared. Maybe that is exactly why his death feels sadder than the quietness of the story might suggest. Thalmus Rasulala died in October 1991 of a heart attack at just 55 years old. That was still far too young for a life and career like his to come to an end. He was a man who still had the strength to work, who was still active in the business, and yet his life was suddenly cut short in a single moment. And maybe that is the saddest part of Thalmus Rasulala's story. A talent who had moved quietly through his career in the end also left this world quietly, but the space he left behind was far from small. If these good times stars still live in your memory, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us as we look back at the lives time changed forever.